And as a preview for next week, our final Brownbag installment for this semester will be the winner of the layered essay competition, and we are proud that the winner with a very interesting essay is our own graduating MA student, John Stanko, who will present about the role of education in Russia-China relations. And then, of course, Friday next week is going to be our customary stop meeting. Because some faculty are on exams early in this morning, we were asked to move it slightly later, so we'll be at 11 a.m. Looking ahead, of course, on May 12th, we will have our traditional graduation/celebration ceremony. And as always, please stay tuned to our emails, follow our Facebook page, and there'll be a lot of wonderful things coming up later on as well. And now I will pass the floor to Justina Weineck, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Leva, for being here. It is my pleasure to welcome our faithful attendee of the Tuesday Brownbag lectures. Now you are on this side of the desk. Let me just give you a real introduction to Professor Leva, whom we all know, but perhaps there are very interesting things I found out which I didn't know about, so I'll share them with you. Professor Marie-Alice Leroux is a registered architect with over 25 years of practice. She obtained her doctorate from the University of California, Berkeley in 2002 and has taught at UC Berkeley, at the Ivan Franko University in Lviv, Ukraine, and for the Kansas City Art Institute summer program in Kecskemét, Hungary. Professor Leroux has been at the University of Kansas since the fall of 2003, teaching architectural design and a variety of seminars on the city and sustainability. She worked in the Energy and Environment Division at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory in the mid-1990s and does research writing and teaching on the social and cultural issues that surround the successful implementation of principles of sustainability. These issues have led her to focus on power and the built landscape and to examine the question, who gets to build what, where, and how? She's especially interested in the legacy of infrastructural investment and the impact of unequal development over time. Geographically, her work has focused on the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, as well as on the major cities of the United States and Canada. Dr. Leroux has written numerous book reviews, articles, and papers on urban infrastructure, sustainability, and the socialist city. I will end here. Thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I really seriously, this paper that I'm going to present, is a paper that I'm presenting at the Baltic Conference in Stanford University on June 2nd. And I'm very thankful that I got this kind of sort of push to get going on it, to get ready for this, this conference, this presentation. But unfortunately, my teaching load is totally ridiculous. You know, I have 19 hours of contact time a week and prep time and all the other stuff, and have 2 students finishing PhDs this semester. I just haven't had time to concentrate on it. So this paper is in progress, and so I'm going to read parts of it, skip over other parts, and then refer to other things. One of the things that strikes me, I have been, oops, that's not my paper. That's it. I have been to quite a few of these, as you've said, and I find them always very fascinating. And one of the things that, I don't know how to do it. Okay, is, what am I supposed to press? So? Maybe I'll just go. Oh. Ah, okay, all right. It's sort of the, you know, I mean, I study architecture, and the communist attitude about the what's art and architecture is that it's a superstructure. It's not part of the base or the organization of things. But I've found over the years that obviously the built environment has a huge impact on the way people understand space, the way they experience it, the way they see their place in the world, their level of comfort, whether they can, what kinds of spaces promote sociability and interactions, and what kinds of spaces does the state take over and sort of impose ideas on the people. And so I thought I'd give, because I know you're not architects, architectural historians, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background on how some of these ideas have evolved, and so that when I talk about the, this idea of style, which is a complicated concept from my point of view, because styles are generally the sort of the decorative surface of a building and not the way they function within. So you need to look at plans in order to understand social relationships and how they're connected to the space around them, as well as, a building can have a Gothic facade and a Roman facade and look identical. And two things can, like a grid of streets in the American context is called a Jeffersonian grid, and it's supposed to represent democracy and republicanism, so that each space is interconnected with other spaces, but not necessarily in a hierarchical position. But of course, ancient Chang'an in China was an ancient city that was also on a grid, but it's very much hierarchically organized, where you start with how far deeply you can go into the city, which is now what city? The Tiananmen Square, called the which city? Forbidden City, yeah, the Forbidden City is part of that. The thing is that, the emperor was heading, his back was to the north and was protecting the people from all of these things. So it's very complicated when you talk about style and you talk about architectural form, because it's not just the form of it itself, it also has to do with the understanding, the meanings that are embedded in it by the designers, as well as the way it's utilized. So this is sort of the paradigmatic slide, and it's been interpreted in many different ways. It was by this abbot, Marc-Antoine Laugier, from 1753, and it was his treatises in architecture, and this was sort of at the end of the Baroque period, and he was thinking that architecture had got too ornamented, and that it needed to go back to its basics. So if you see at the foot of the lady architect, is that the pointer work? These columns, oops. Oh, now I've got it to do it. All right. Sorry, which one do I have to go to? This one works worse than the one in my office. Okay. And what's enter? Okay, anyways. So these are the remnants of Roman columns. This is a fluted column. This is a capital, and these are dentils. And here's the lady architect. This is a young student architect, and it's called the primitive hut. So the primitive hut is basically columns, vertical columns that should be straight, and this is a pediment, so it supports the load and it creates the shelter for the thing, and it has these it has these coverings. So basically a dwelling is basically composed out of these three components that need to be pure, and they're connected to the places where they're located. And not too long ago, we had a presentation by Chris Cornelius, who's from the Oneida tribe in Minnesota, Madison, excuse me. And he was telling the students that, and he showed this slide, which is, very common in architecture lectures. But he said that she was pointing to this as saying, nature is there, this is nature, as opposed to the Native Americans' idea of it that nature is within us and as part of us. And it says this whole idea, this understanding of our position in nature has actually affected the way architecture has been designed over the years. Recently, last Thursday here at the Commons, there was a lecture by Andrea Wolff, on the invention of nature, and she talked about Alexander von Humboldt, who was an explorer from. He was born in 1769, died in 1859, and he was actually the person who wrote about and had the biggest impact on the way we think about nature today. And he had, in fact, Darwin would have never gone on the Beagle if he hadn't read von Humboldt. And Ernest Haeckel, who was a German biologist, started understanding that there wasn't this separation not only between human beings and nature, but also science and nature, that there were these aspects of human creativity, whether it's within science or art or literature or poetry or anything, are all intertwined and have similar principles and bases. And they shouldn't be prioritized one over the other. They all make up the way we understand the world. And so, so this idea that we are part of nature and that we should design in that way. And today, I mean, these idea of these vertical columns, you've probably been in buildings where columns aren't vertical, where the walls aren't horizontal, where they create these kind of these angled dynamic spaces that students call dynamic, that they really like and they enjoy. But if you ask ordinary people, that these angles are actually sort of unsettling for people, that in order to have calm right angles and perpendiculars and maybe with a slight curve to them are what creates these most peaceful kinds of places. So, this oops, not this one. Okay, so so this little angel was sort of the beginning part. 1666 was when the in France, Colbert set up a Prix de Rome, a prize for Rome, where the French architects or builders would go to Rome to see the ancient ruins. And from that evolved this École des Beaux-Arts, the Beaux-Arts school. And one of the reasons I'm talking about this is because there was a whole discussion in the 20th century about what is modernism, what is modern, like is socialist realist modern, where does this socialist realist tradition fit into the discussion and the history of architecture. So this is by it's Jean-Germain J.G. Soufflot, 1758. It was originally called Sainte Geneviève in Paris. Now, after the Revolution, it was called La Madeleine, and it has echoes of. Oh, I know what it is. The pointer is too close to the changer. That's what the problem is. And so this is the Pantheon in Rome, and it has echoes of St. Peter's Dome. And actually, it was a similar. The dome was similarly used by Christopher Wren in the St. Paul's in London. So these architectural ideas, really diffused and dispersed everywhere. And the Beaux-Arts, even though it had the biggest impact, obviously, in France and actually in the United States, because many of young architects studied in France, and so they imbibed this tradition of this classical architecture, and you see it everywhere in the United States. But it actually also, at the Altes Museum in Germany, also is part of this kind of tradition. But in England, they associated this Renaissance, this neoclassicalism, and this Beaux-Arts with Rome, which Catholic, and then after the takeover of the English Church, the Gothic became the style that was seen as purely British. But there are aspects of Gothic in this church, for instance, even though architecturally it looks like Roman architecture, within its structure and its building, it has Gothic proportions. It's very light inside in the traditions of that. And so this is École des Beaux-Arts. You can see the stacked pediments, this idea of the rusticated, oh geez. I have my own clicker that I use at school, so I don't have this problem. So this is rusticated, so it's usually a rough lower level, and then the orders, there are like three major orders, the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian, and they're usually stacked up. So the Doric is seen as more masculine and supports a big heavy weight, and then the Ionic's next on top, and then the Corinthian, but in this case this is Corinthian. So this was actually built in, I think, 1819, the actual building that was built. But this is where the school was. And people would come from all over the world to study here. And it was the Beaux-Arts tradition, in fact, at Berkeley, that's how the School of Architecture was started. It was based on the Beaux-Arts traditions. And then after it actually adopted the Bauhaus traditions. Oops, I get in the wrong one. Let's see. And so this is between the Beaux-Arts and the sort of the Gothic revival. During the late 19th century, there was all of this discussion among architects and theorists about, this style, where is this modern style? Why are we echoing, the Gothic and the Renaissance and the Romanesque and all of these things? Why can't we find something that's truly representative of today? Things have changed. We have these, new materials, and why do our buildings still look like they did in the past? And so rather than this was actually called the young style, the Jugendstil, or the secessionists in Austria, and it had all kinds of, and there's still a half dozen other countries that call it slightly different names. But, oops, I really did not press that one. I pressed the right button. So in the Jugendstil is probably one that you've heard of, or maybe even secession, the Austrian secession stil, sort of the Weimar secession movement. And so when World War I ended, sort of the lead up to World War I, there were movements, the futurists. There was this idea of, how do we represent this new modern era? Things were speeding up. The cities were changing. There were, the trains were here, and all of these aspects of it. And this was even before planes. But it was realized by some theorists like Peter Collins, who was my history professor at McGill, that there was a new modern architecture going on, but it was in new types of buildings. So there were these train stations that were being built that hadn't been there before, in market spaces, in like the Crystal Palace in 1851 in England, that with this glass building that was so the expression of this new architecture was in these new types of buildings. And the banks still look like Roman temples. But this Art Nouveau, this is kind of an odd one to show, but Gaudi's building, if you're familiar with that in Spain, there are all of these sort of, that Art Nouveau where it grew out of Macintosh, sort of the Scottish-British influence in this, where they had, floweries, so all this decoration, but it was meant to be locally based so that, the plants that grew in the area would grow into the buildings. And it was sort of also a response, and even though they were promoting arts and crafts movement and handicraft rather than strictly this the machine aesthetic, a lot of it was able to do all of this frilly stuff because of mass production. And interestingly enough, Alexander von Humboldt, that intrepid pioneer of modern thinking and who really understood nature as the web of life, and he's the one who there are more places named after von Humboldt than anyone else in the world. And so, but he was forgotten largely in this country, probably because of World War I and the German antagonism. But in 1869, at his 100th anniversary, there were huge parades all over the United States celebrating him and his legacy. And so he had he had Darwin and the author of Walden Pond, Thoreau, and also Ernst Haeckel, who was a biologist, as I started saying earlier on. And he was torn because he was very fascinated by art and fascinated by biology because he was a zoologist. And so he started doing these incredible drawings he had a gift where he could look through a microscope and then do these drawings. And so he had this thing, design, the nature of design and nature, so these things together. And I thought I had put a thing, but I didn't include a picture of it. Too bad. But anyways, it was these incredible, little tiny creatures blown up that had these kind of fascination for people. They'd never seen anything like that, and they couldn't imagine that these things existed in the world. And so that kind of that along with this arts and crafts movement translated into this Art Nouveau, which had its heyday from about the 1890s to about 1910. World War I sort of dramatically changed everything in architecture. Just before the war, there were also these futurists from Italy, as well as even the Russian futurists were a little bit later. But these ideas of speed and sort of movement being shown in art and literature. So it's not that frilly stuff of life, but but these cut down things. And one of the things that grew out of it in 1919 after World War I was this group called the Bauhaus, and they had a profound effect on architecture, and they still do today. And they're the ones responsible for modern architecture in the sense that this, you know, it's technologically driven. You know, it's repetitious, it's clean lines, the windows create patterns. What it did is, in traditional architecture, those idea of the columns supporting the weight, that was always demonstrated because if you couldn't, you know, like even these buildings that are built of stone, these columns have these widths and the walls have depth that you don't see this. So modern architecture, one of its principles is it sort of hides its structure. You know, the windows are continuous over the structure and they don't express that. And also they taught all the arts, the mechanical arts, you know, not literature or poetry, but any of the arts that painting, fabric design, all that stuff. But they didn't teach architecture because they considered architecture to be the culmination of this type of construction. Okay, and so I'm gonna guess I'll start with my talk. So this is Nora Esti, which is good. I probably only have 15 minutes worth, even though I have 27 pages written. This was Young Estonia was the first group well, not the first. Estonian National Awakening, you probably know most of the history. Estonia was part of the Tsarist Empire after 1710 when Peter the Great conquered the area around the Baltic Sea. And he defeated King Charles XII, I think, of Sweden, and basically took over the Baltic. And he wanted it as a warm water port. He thought that he could, he wanted to control that area so that he could have a closer connection to Europe, actually. And and then before that it was part of Sweden, and before that it was under the control of the Danes. And throughout the entire history there were always this group of German-speaking Knights of the Baron, Baron Knights. They came in the 12th, 13th century and occupied Estonia and basically set up a fealty. So they were the rulers, and they didn't really interact very much with the Estonians, except that the Estonians worked the land and were the peasants on their properties, basically. And until the 1860s, 70s, 80s, which was considered the period of awakening for Estonians in Russia. In Russia, it was part of the Tsarist Empire, and Karl Kreutzwald created this he wrote down basically this narrative poem called Kalevi Poeg, which is a son of Kalev, which is related to the Finnish story called Kalevala. And in it sort of was that sort of marks not the resurgence, but maybe after 500 years, the Estonians didn't have an independent identity as Estonians, because back when they were pre-Danish or pre-Christianized, they were obviously these different clans that had different languages that were related to each other. They were like Gallians and Litvans and all these different peoples that lived in this area. And so the Livonians were a group of students at Tartu University who started to get together, and they developed a flag for themselves, and the colors, blue, black, and white. And then in the 1880s, the Tsarist Empire started controlling more they wanted to Russify the provinces. They felt that the non-Russian speaking areas of the empire weren't Russian enough. And so, the Estonians at the time thought of it as, well, this will help subvert German power within the province. And so they kind of went along with it for a while, but then realized that Russification had its downside, just as the Germanification basically that existed there. So just in the start of my talk, in a famous speech on July 6, 1870, in the small town of Helme, Estonia, Jakob Hirt, the forerunner in promoting, collecting, and documenting Estonian folklore during the last half of the 19th century, asked rhetorically, how can Estonians, who are so few in number, become great and powerful? He argued that although Estonians could not become great in population and political power, they could become great in culture. He contended that a strong culture was more powerful than the size of the country, the number of people, or political power. This idea of focusing on Estonian culture contrasted with the goal of achieving political and economic power promoted by other leaders of the National Awakening movement, such as Karl Robert Jakobsen and the painter Johan Köhler. Hurt also mobilized the succeeding generations of students and young nationalists, such as Wilhelm Reinmann, to help in this effort of collecting folk culture of all kinds. He rallied people from all over Estonia to comb their possessions for contributions to the collection. This raised a level of awareness among Estonians about the value of their patrimony and gave them a sense of shared history. This collection was eventually donated in 1909 to create the Estonia National Museum, Eesti Rahva Muuseumu, in Tartu. The ERA also wanted to create an open-air museum in a natural setting that would preserve the village structure, the domestic buildings, furnishings, and the tools of everyday life that represented the varied construction and dwelling practices that existed across Estonia from the 18th to the 20th century. Few, if any, intellectuals of the early awakening period imagined a free Estonia. Mostly they struggled to achieve as much autonomy as possible, whether by directly undermining German hegemony or aligning themselves with Russian imperialism to weaken the German hold on power. Those who focused on culture considered folk art to be purely Estonian and uncontaminated by outside influences. In the view of turn-of-the-century Estonians, Baltic lords had so steadfastly remained aloof from the native populations during the centuries of occupation or colonization that the two lines of artistic development had emerged: the art of the master, Baltic German, and folk art, Estonian. The definition of a national identity based on folk art became transformed over time into a movement for national independence and thence to its realization. Art, identity, folklore, and nationalism became intertwined in the struggle for and achievement of Estonian independence and in the representation of a national identity. The slogan, "More culture, more European culture. Be Estonian, but become European as well," that Young Estonia published in 1905 in the first of its 5 albums, which is this, Noor Eesti, is Young Estonian, exemplified the conflict between nationalist and modernist expressions. This is a very commonly quoted phrase in Estonia even today and highlights outward-looking tendencies of Estonians tempered by a desire for cultural self-preservation. Unrest and uncertainty filled the interval between 1905 and 1917 Russian revolutions. As the idea of Estonian self-government became plausible, the rhetoric of independence and national identity increased. Intellectuals began to appreciate the preciousness and uniqueness of their own culture, which impelled them to define the characteristics of these distinctions formally. Those concerned with art, architecture, and dwellings were interested in following European trends on the one hand and giving an independent form to their budding national identity on the other. Whether they sought to modernize a traditional dwelling or to understand how a small country in an international context could maintain its identity, they first tried to define what an Estonian style should be and thence to give it form. Estonian students studying in the universities in Russia at the beginning of World War I were caught in the crosshairs of shifting political alliances. The future art critic Hanno Kompus was evacuated along with many others to Moscow to continue his art and architecture education after war disrupted his studies at the Riga Polytechnic Institute in 1915. While in Riga, he had participated in the activities of the Livonia Society, the group that had originally adopted the blue, black, and white colors that became Estonia's national flag, which heightened his identity with Estonia. By continuing his studies, he hoped to avoid conscription into the Russian army during the First World War, which he considered a death sentence. While in Moscow, the 25-year-old Kompas corresponded with his friend and architect Edgar Kusik, often in enigmatic terms about Estonian identity, possibly to avoid censorship. Kompas was concerned, as many others had been, that Estonia's small size and scant population made it unrealistic as an independent nation. "What kind of style could small people have?" he wrote in 1916, after describing Estonia as an engraving rather than a fresco. Rephrasing Hurt's characterization of Estonians from 40 years earlier, however, we do not have, he said, we do not have the space of the village, not the masses, pas d'assez d'espace, he says in French, in order to achieve the effect of the fresco. But we build with the money we do not have, by actors we do not possess, for an audience we lack. Estonia, I cannot help myself. But the most ridiculous thing we have done so far seems to be that Estonia exists. Oh, we have to study the laws of fresco and drawing. In 1916, of course, Estonia was still not a political reality, although its dim outline was visible since political leaders hoped to achieve some kind of autonomy. But it is clear that it had taken form in the minds of the people. For Kompas, large nations differed from small nations as symphony orchestras contrasted with chamber ensembles. In a small country, everybody has to be a virtuoso. In his view, an unlikely scenario that weighed on him. Nevertheless, Estonia did produce many virtuosos, not necessarily internationally recognized, but mavericks nonetheless, such as the painter Hans Leichmann and Jakob Hirt, who sacrificed their own artistic production to expand the artistic base of their people. And here I go in a little bit about cooperatives and associations. Estonian architects were one of the later groups within Estonia to organize. They really didn't form a league until 1921, but the literary societies had organized in 1871, Young Estonia in 1905, and the Estonian Art Society started by Leichmann in 1906. And architecture was often considered also a subcategory of art, as is evident by all the books and journals that whenever it says Eesti Kunst, they mean Estonian art, and they mean everything from poetry to architecture to leather making and knitting. It was considered an art. And so, let's see. And then one of my ideas about the architectural field comes from Pierre Bourdieu's concept of a cultural field. And that's my argument of the importance of architecture in the built and cultural realms is embodying or framing a national identity. Although we can discuss how much architects actually contribute and how much it is manipulated by those who have real power in the state, regardless of ideology. And before I started this research, I would have said that because architects, they have their own organization. So even within a very powerful structure like a totalitarian state, the field operates according to their rules and regulations. And I show in some work that I've been writing that the architectural profession, which usually the designs of major civic projects usually evolve through design competitions. And these are held according to the principles of the profession of architecture, not according to the state. And there have innumerable examples of design competitions that were held during the Estonian Republican years from 1918 to 1940. And then these exact same competitions were held again under the Soviet system for the same project, except instead of being an independence memorial, it was for a victory monument under the Soviet system. And the Estonians knew that the siting and the programmatic requirements would not be achievable given the site. There was all these constrained sites. But they wasted time, if you want, spent 3 times having these competitions sent out. And finally, the last one in 1953, the Moscow said, you cannot do these, you have to do a competition that will be achievable to honor the brotherhood of the Soviet peoples and our great leader Stalin. And so it was from that point they still had, but they had to broaden the openness, and then they moved the competition from this awkward site where they actually eventually built a monument in about 6 years ago, to where the Estonia Theater was, and it was kind of flat land, and they had like 151 submissions for these, and every one was a monster plinth with Stalin at the top, except the Estonians, for the most part, committed. They still were doing their little monuments with, if they mentioned Stalin at all, it was inside, underneath the statue, and without a statue. But there was one group of young Estonians who won 3rd prize, actually, and they had a big picture of monument on Stalin. So the competition was completed March 6, 1953, and several weeks later, Stalin died. So Estonia never built its big Stalin monument, which is pretty good. So even though, there were usually the dynamics within the field come from the struggles among individuals within the field, such as established practitioners, upstarts, and renegades. Those usually create the conditions to provoke change in architecture. And then, let's see, in the age of nations, the question of how to express cultural uniqueness or a particular ideology was ubiquitous in defining new national entities. Many theories that predominated in Germany in this quest, from Gottfried Semper's Principles of Style, developed from the Applied Arts to the Deutsche Werkbunds, 1907 to 1934, the German Union of Work, integration of art, industry, and crafts with its emphasis on construction quality, reverberated through similar discussions in Estonia. And then I cover a bit about that. And I think I'm going to go to leave questions for time for questions. So, in the view of its contemporaries, one of the most successful of the early buildings constructed by the new Republic of Estonia was the Riigikogu, the Parliament building in 1922. The Baltic German architect Ernst Kühnert described the Riigikogu in 1926 as the most interesting and architecturally estimable building that has been built recently in Estonia and generally in the Baltic states. Let's see. This is a plan of it. The building is also one of the few modern buildings discussed in the international press, even garnering a mention in the New York Times in 1933, I think. I forget when it was. The Riigikogu site was over the ancient Estonian-built Linnanisa citadel. The pre-occupation fortress of Lindanisa, Lindis-Tiit, literally and metaphorically connected Estonians back through their mythology to their original independent status. Sending the parliament here reclaimed the original site and placed it on top of the architectural production of all conquerors from the first Danish fortress of 1229 and the Livonian convent building of 1350, on whose foundations the parliament was built all the way to Catherine the Great's government offices that were built in 1788 and which eventually became a prison. The Riigikogu is part of the larger Toompea castle complex and sits across and to the right of an enclosed courtyard, so is not visible to passers-by. So this is the, oops, all right. This is Losiplatz, which is Castle Square. This is eventually becomes the Parliament building right here. You can see the plan there. And this is the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, which was built in 1900 by Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, in order to honor his father, who had been assassinated, Tsar Alexander III. I'm not sure if actually Nicholas ever came to Tallinn, but he understood that there were no really Russian cathedrals in Tallinn. There were all these German cathedrals, and so he had one built. And he also, in 1910, had a statue of Peter the Great erected in the square in Tallinn. Oops, sorry, I keep forgetting that. It's not the one. Okay, so this is a bad slide, but you can see this is the Alexander Nevsky Cathedral, and this is down here is the hill. This is the upper town, the upper medieval town, and there's different pathways. There's one that comes down here and next to this Kik in de Kerk, peek in the kitchen, kind of from the 12th century tower. And then it goes on here, and there's a couple of other little places to come down from the high tower to the low tower. And the original competitions I was telling you about, the Victory Monument, were on this slope here, which is called Harjumäe slope, because this is Harju. So, so this is the cathedral, and then this building here becomes the Estonian Parliament. The prestige of the Riigikogu is not in the particular majesty of this building, but in its placement on this historically significant site. Its hidden location did not signify secrecy to Estonians, since the entire complex represented the government. Peaked Hermann is a tall tower, is the only extant of the 4 ancient towers, and it flew the national flag, which was widely visible and testified daily to Estonian independence. Although today architectural historians consider the stout proportions of the Riigikogu more in line with a provincial burgher's house and reproach its unpretentious style and ineffectual presence, contemporaneous critics and politicians focused on the symbolic and real importance of the building and its location. In his inaugural address on 12 September 1922, the Prime Minister Konstantin Päts resoundingly spoke of the epic struggle that brought Estonians to this new parliament, the many oppressors that had been vanquished, and the numerous Estonian groups whose tireless efforts formed the cornerstone of the parliament. Here in this castle dwelled the most abhorrent, the most dangerous, the most powerful enemies of Estonian independence, and Estonians bested them all. Estonians, that was my addition, not his. Estonians adapted the building framework and appropriated the location and symbols of their former oppressors to demonstrate their triumph, not because they lacked imagination or stylistic sophistication. For instance, Pates designated the thistle and grapevine which adorned two ancient stone tablets flanking the doors outside the Parliament chamber to be symbolic of the need to serve the nation, thinking that they predated the Danish occupation. He called them symbols of the people who ruled here for centuries. Let all who come here by the will of the people and in the name of the people champion the well-being of the people and take these as their symbol. Oops. Sorry. So this is a drawing of the building, and this is a photograph I took in 2009. And then these are the doors. These are the grapes and the heather that they found on these ancient tablets that they thought dated from the early 13th century, but in fact actually date from the 16th. Moreover, keep in mind that the fate of our people hangs from them, regardless of whether thistles or grapes grow in our land. Imbricated triangles of varying width, hidden light sources, rich colors, and where eminence demanded somber stained wood, all created a theme that traveled through the interior and exterior of the Parliament. Krishna had made much of the technological innovations of central heating, air conditioning equipment, and recessed lighting, all of which were carefully hidden behind plaster cornices and molding. Let's see if I can. So these are the imbricated, means sort of layered, stacked on it. So these are imbricated, and then I'll show you a picture. I think, oh, maybe I don't have it. These is brightly colored yellow, sort of like furrows in the field. And this is looking away from the dais to the back of the room, and this is like the newspaper area. So this is soon after it was taken. He suggested that Martcom, in discussing the symbolic importance of these decorative elements in 1998, suggested that the regularity of the pyramid-like elements that shape the ceilings reinforce the democratic principles of equality and the need to consider all sides of a question before voting. Kalm described a tour that one of the architects, Eugene Haberman, gave to lawmakers, during which they asked about the significance of the zigzag motif. According to Edgar Cusick's manuscript, Haberman quipped that the serration was to sharpen the spirit of the people's representatives in their deliberations. The main Parliament room also had a spectacular ceiling of plaster furrows suspended over the assembly, reminiscent of a plowed field. The parliamentary space included 120 seats for legislature, a press area behind, and a visitors gallery with 250 seats above. Artistic panels and sculptures were planned for the recesses above the door behind the podium, but were not realized during the Republican years. The building survived World War II. Let's see. Oh yeah, this is it. This is actually during the Soviet period. This is a head of Stalin, and then there are these brotherhood plaques on either side describing the Soviet victory. But otherwise than that, the benches might have been renovated, but the configuration of the place stayed pretty much the same. And it survived World War II, and let's see, I think maybe I have one more picture. Oh, yeah. When this is, so there's, oops. Gosh. Okay, so this is the Nevsky Cathedral. This is two Soviet soldiers, and they're looking down onto the right here you can see the edge of the Riigikogu, and they're up next to the Herman Tower which will always hung the Estonian flag, and they're putting up the hammer and sickles. And this was just, I was going to show you, this was from the 1919, and this was Peter the Great statue that had been there, that was erected in 1910 in the plaza, and I think I'm pretty much, this was, oh yeah. And during the Estonian independence, that Alexander Nevsky Cathedral that you can just see right in the back, little tiny bits of it, they were trying to tear it down, but they didn't want to spend the money. It was very expensive to tear this very massive thing. And so they thought that they'd build this thing they called the Pantheon in front of it. And then when they got chance they would dismantle the domes, or maybe there was thinking of maybe replacing these, leaving the building the way it was, but just replacing these onion domes with more democratic looking square things. And then this, but it survived, and this is what it looks like today. And it was renovated soon after Estonian independence again. And this is the Estonian Freedom Monument that was built on Freedom Square, and it was opened in 2009. And it was also a design competition, but this is one of the things that give you pause. It's obviously artists consider it hideous, and it's basically an emblem from a traditional Estonian. Let's see, I guess I don't have a picture. I thought I got a picture of it. This is an Estonian medal, war medal, that's embedded here. But this four-sided cross, is sort of it's not even really it's sort of the Scandinavian motif of their flags are in the cross shape. And there was a huge discussion in Estonia when they were deciding on their national flag, whether they should, because it has three stripes, blue, black, and white stripes, whether it should align itself more directly with the Scandinavian countries and have it a cross shape in these different colors. But they argued that many young Estonians had already died under the blue, black, and white flag even before it was designated, because it was a Livonia society that, these young people that had enlisted in the army to defend Estonian independence. So, and then this last slide here, this picture basically tells so much about Estonian history. This is that monument. This is Jaanikirik. This is that slope where they tried to build the War of Independence monuments there for both. They had at least 4 competitions during the Estonian Republic period till 1940, and then after independence from 1990 to 2006, when this was actually built, they had at least a half dozen. But it was basically a committee of generals and politicians who picked this winner. They stopped letting architects have a say in the competition. And this is the Estonia Theater, which was one of that was built in 1911 designed by a Finnish architect, which really sort of establishes Estonian identity. This is Peak Hanneman, where you have that tall, the flag, and these are some of the old 12th, 13th century churches, and that's Kikinekuk. Okay, so 4 minutes to spare. So there's some questions if you'd like. Yeah.
Architects need to have their ideas built, and so you
Right.
need a patron or somebody who finances.
Right.
So right away there is perhaps compromise necessary over between the ideal and what's possible.
Right.
And in
Convincing your
Estonia,
client to spend the
or-
money, that's exactly
or
the
with
thing.
the
Yeah.
nobility or whatever. In Estonia, where also the nobility was of different nationality
Sure.
than the peasants.
Yeah.
And who pays for it, perhaps it's not the national style or what. I mean, I'm
Right.
interested in that
Yeah.
relationship of, especially when, because in Hungary, the nobility was, they were the spearheads of national movement.
And they were Austrian.
No, well,
They were also Magyar, or?
Well, yeah, well, most of them lived and couldn't speak the language. They
Right.
learned it afterwards.
Right.
But I'm interested in that relationship, especially when the nobility is of different nationality.
Right.
So how does this work with both this compromise and when the nationality is different, is a double compromise perhaps, or how does this
Yeah,
work?
that's interesting. It's sort of like if you look at the Czech case, after World War I, when Czechoslovakia became a country, they actually had demonstrated, that was sort of the thing that kind of waylaid me in my presentation, because I was starting to think in the Czech Republic during the 1920 to 1919 to 1938 or 40, something like that, they were actually part of the avant-garde in the modern architecture movement, the Bauhaus sort of impact on it. And it was because they didn't have that legacy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so they were able to, and there was a Bata shoe company who was very much involved with developing this language and creating housing for workers using the modern style. It's fascinating. In Estonia, they sort of focused in on traditional arts and crafts as a way of embodying it. They said, well, every area in Estonia has its own national dress, although I've never looked to see if their national dress is as illegitimate as the Scottish kilts, you know. They're not really, you know, they aren't really Scottish kilts. But, you know, as far as I can tell, they had their knitting patterns and their weaving patterns that they used. And then during Estonian independence, they were very much hampered in the beginning because they were saddled with the debt from the Russian Empire. They had a share of the debt that they had to pay. And it took them quite a while to get out from underneath that. And so, you know, I think part of the modesty of their national legislature was because of that. And then they never got to build most of these things were built by subscription. You know, like the Estonia Theater, the people of Estonia contributed to build the theater. And the same thing, everybody in Estonia managed to build a little monument to their war dead in the local parishes and in the farm areas. But the Soviets, over the course of the Soviet occupation, they tore down 118 out of the 124 individual monuments because they called the Estonian Republic a bourgeois dictatorship. And which it was a little bit at the end a bit of a dictatorship, but they weren't able to express their you know, the Soviet Union destroyed them, and it basically hid all mention of them in any of the records because it would obstruct their narrative of saying that it was a civil war. It wasn't a war of independence.
And you
so
thought on this compromise necessary between the ideal and
yeah.
feasible.
Famous architects tend not to compromise too much, but ordinary architects, if they want to get their work built, yeah, they compromise. And I think that it's a good thing because a lot of times architects, like I say, with the angled walls, and my students design all these kind of crazy things. You know, we're doing a childcare center, and a bunch of them, not in my half of the studio and my colleagues' half, put their building underground. And I'm thinking, what do you think, these children are larvae, you know? It's like, you know, and they're saying, well, they want to protect them. I said, you know, protect them from what? You know, dirty old men, you know, so they can look down on them, but they can't, the kids, you know, it's crazy thinking. So there is there's some way of thinking about design that architects, I have a problem with because I was in practice for so long, so I exactly know how to compromise my desires to get works built. But I think that's a good thing because sometimes architects have crazy ideas. Yes?
I can't remember. I wasn't paying close to, what was the name of the building there, that large building in the middle right?
That's the yellow one, or?
Yeah, that big yellow.
That's the Estonia Theater.
Okay.
And it's called Estonia, Esthonia, and it's always been called Estonia, with the quotes.
Did you say kind of characterize the eventual development of
Yeah,
Estonia?
it's one of the, yes, it's kind of a pivotal building. It's a building that the Soviets bombed, like in March 44, right before they re-entered Estonia. In fact, they must have targeted them because there are 6 major theaters in Estonia, and every one of them was bombed. It's not by accident. But so one of the first things the Russians did, the Soviets did, is they rebuilt the Estonia Theater. They had a design competition, and it was built. So it wasn't completely torn down, so they rebuilt on the footprint, but it changed slightly the aesthetics of it. They got rid of all the, you know, they used to have little restaurants in there and shops. They got rid of that stuff, and yeah. So Estonians feel this is part of their cultural identity. This is very, very much sort of a classical revival kind of thing. It doesn't really have to do with Estonian architecture. And I had a lot of trouble finding, you know, in my discussion about national identity in Estonia during the Republican period, and that's what got me thinking about the Czechs, who were so good about national identity, which became a modernist identity. In Estonia, it tended to be more grounded in the vernacular rather than in the modern aspects. There were a few architects. Everybody did some little modern house, you know, trimmed down, no sloped roof, no wood, kind of, you know, plaster thing. But anyways, I've gone over time. Little did I think. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much.